Your four favorites are Donnie Darko, Mulholland Drive, Napoleon Dynamite, and Punch Drunk Love. My top choice for you is Southland Tales. Like Donnie Darko, it's a sci-fi film directed by Richard Kelly, and he clearly drew inspiration from Mulholland Drive because it even includes a scene of Rebecca Del Rio performing. It's also a comedy that was released in the mid-2000s like Napoleon Dynamite, and it's got some absurdity and it's set in LA like Punch Drunk Love. Source Code is a sci-fi film that involves the manipulation of time and stars Jake Gyllenhaal like Donnie Darko. Like Mulholland Drive, it feels like there are multiple versions of reality that feel fabricated and make the protagonist's identity feel unstable. Like Napoleon Dynamite, the main character feels kind of out of place. And like Punch Drunk Love, he's anxious or alienated and there's an element of romance. Slacker is an offbeat comedy like Napoleon Dynamite. And like Donnie Darko, it involves discussions of time travel and the Smurfs. Ghost World was released in 2001, just like the first two films in your favorites. It's a coming-of-age movie like Donnie Darko and Napoleon Dynamite. And the characters feel alienated like Donnie Darko, but the film also has a socially awkward, deadpan sense of humor like Napoleon Dynamite. It's got two female protagonists like Mulholland Drive. Like Punch Drunk Love, the characters feel emotionally stuck or lost or anxious. And like Mulholland Drive, Patrick Fischler's in it. Speaking of which, in this scene from Ghost World, someone is trying to rent a copy of Fellini's 8½, which is a movie I think you might like since you're a fan of Mulholland Drive, because it's sort of surreal and involves dreams, filmmakers, and the fantasies or stories people tell themselves to avoid reality. And since I brought up Patrick Fischler, he's actually in two other movies I think you might like. Under the Silver Lake, which is a surrealist neo-noir set in LA like Mulholland Drive, and Idiocracy, which is sci-fi like Donnie Darko, but also a comedy like Napoleon Dynamite. Harold and Maude, like Donnie Darko, is about an alienated young man and themes of death and existential dread. Like Mulholland Drive, there's this element of pretending, performing, or faking something. Like Napoleon Dynamite, the characters are outsiders or outcasts, and there's this sort of deadpan sense of humor. And like Punch Drunk Love, it involves an unconventional romance. Peggy Sue Got Married is kind of like Donnie Darko meets Punch Drunk Love. Richard Kelly even showed the crew scenes from this movie when working on Donnie Darko to create this idealized, nostalgic version of reality. And like Donnie Darko, this movie involves time travel, and it's an offbeat romantic comedy like Punch Drunk Love. Speaking of offbeat romantic comedies, Wild at Heart also has romance and comedy like Punch Drunk Love, but it's also a neo-noir directed by David Lynch like Mulholland Drive. Like Donnie Darko, there are moments that feel dreamlike, and it's got eccentric characters like Napoleon Dynamite. Speaking of movies starring Nicolas Cage, I also want to recommend Adaptation. Like Mulholland Drive, it's about identity, it's got a non-linear narrative, and involves people who work in the film industry. It's also a comedy where the main characters are awkward like Napoleon Dynamite and anxious like in Punch Drunk Love. And like Donnie Darko, Maggie Gyllenhaal's in it. And one more Nicolas Cage movie while I'm on a roll, Raising Arizona has some deadpan, absurd humor with quirky and awkward characters like Napoleon Dynamite and Punch Drunk Love. Welcome to the Dollhouse is a suburban coming-of-age film about awkward and alienated characters like Donnie Darko and Napoleon Dynamite. Muriel's Wedding has an alienated protagonist like Donnie Darko who essentially constructs a dream or fantasy version of herself to cope with reality like Mulholland Drive. And she's a socially awkward outsider like Napoleon Dynamite who's dealing with loneliness like Punch Drunk Love. Open Your Eyes has elements of sci-fi like Donnie Darko, and it's a surreal film about dreams like Mulholland Drive. Three movies that I tend to recommend to fans of Mulholland Drive for the way they depict this breakdown of identity are Persona, Three Women, and The Double Life of Veronique. Carnival of Souls, like Donnie Darko, involves someone mysteriously surviving an accident and then being plagued by unusual visions. And the opening scene of this film inspired one of the first scenes in Mulholland Drive where a character loses their memory after an accident. Synecdoche, New York plays with our perception of reality like Donnie Darko. It's about identity like Mulholland Drive and a fractured sense of identity at that. And the characters are socially awkward like Napoleon Dynamite and anxious and longing for connection like Punch Drunk Love.